Welcome to Faculty Voices. Americo Mendoza-Mori is an interdisciplinary scholar whose research focuses on U.S. Latinx and Indigenous communities. He's affiliated with Harvard's Committee on Ethnicity, Migration, Rights, and is currently teaching at Northeastern University. We're talking to him today on the occasion of Hispanic Heritage Month. Welcome, Americo.
Muchas gracias. Hello. Thank you.
First of all, what is Hispanic or Latinx to you? Which term do you prefer?
It might varies because as you introduce my information, I do teach courses on Latino, Latine, Latinx studies. And it's a very, let's say, fluid term in the sense that when I go to get an ID at a government office, the option is Hispanic. Or when we look at census data, the word is Hispanic as well. But then when we maybe engage on more academic or community spaces, the word Latino or Latinx might be the one that is more popular. And that shows us how, let's say, the history and the understanding of the community is very complex. So I would go for understanding that these different terminologies, let's say the fact that we cannot just stick to one, reflects different, let's say, layers of the community.
Mm-hmm. You were the faculty director of the Latinx Studies Working Group here at Harvard. What do you feel has been accomplished and what challenges remain?
One of the things was that we need still to build a sense of recognition of the discipline, because sometimes we don't know where to put Latinx studies. Should we consider it only as U.S. American studies? Should we see it through the lens of Latin American studies? And maybe the first answer is to say that it is both. And not just as a diagnosis for the present, in the sense that we do have Latinos in the US who have migrated, like myself, from Latin America and now live here, but also when thinking about the future, in the sense that I'm an advocate of seeing Latinidad as a more hemispheric conception. And therefore, where do we build up the curricula? So one aspect was to first bring awareness about that aspect and create courses that then address this.
What were some of the courses you created?
So it started with intro courses to Latinx studies, but also looking at pop culture, urban studies of Latinidad, but also putting emphasis in specific communities within Latinidad that are usually overlooked. In particularly, I do research on indigenous communities that sometimes, along with Afro-descendant communities, are left out of the official narrative of Latinidad. So that was another aspect that we tried to foster when crafting activities and classes on Latinx studies at Harvard. And particularly, I was able to teach courses on Quechua, which is a language spoken in South America, and how now there are indigenous migrants and indigenous communities that speak not only Quechua, but Maya, Nahuatl, and now live in cities like Los Angeles, New York, New Jersey, even the Boston area.
Could you tell us how some of these courses made a difference in your students' lives?
I would say that now that we are in a time, in an era of a post-affirmative action, we need to be more intentional on offering curricula that reflects not just diverse, let's say, experience that students might bring, but the diverse traditions of knowledge that different students bring to universities. And by saying that, let's say by hosting a class on indigenous studies or on Quechua language, then we recognize that this tradition of knowledge should be respected the same way as we do with other, let's say, more like European or classical studies. And therefore, we need to attract, as institutions of higher education, students that can expand that area of work or those field studies. And therefore, we've been having students who have been looking for classes like that. We hope to have more classes that can reflect, again, not just the experience, but also the knowledge that would benefit not only those students, but society at large. Just to give you some examples, there's a lot of innovation in terms of food industry that come from indigenous communities. There's a lot of innovation and advocacy in terms of environmental studies that we need to learn and listen. And we see that students do, with some of them that do have connections directly to those communities, want to be, let's say, be nurtured by those classes during college, but also everyone should have the opportunity to know about these different traditions of knowledge.
You mentioned affirmative action. After the Supreme Court banned the use of race as a criteria, the number of Blacks entering Harvard dropped pretty drastically by 4%, yet the percentage of Hispanics rose 2%. Do you think that's a fluke, or do you think there's some reason for that increase?
Right now is some numbers. Let's say we're starting to learn about the data from different universities, and in other schools numbers have dropped for Hispanic and Latino students. So I would say that what we need to make sure is that this disciplines, let's call it ethnic studies, African American studies, indigenous studies, then become, let's say, that institutions, if they really want to keep diversity, they need to support those spaces. And again, it might sound like I'm repeating myself a bit, but not only because of the diversity of, let's say, ethnicity aspect, because we are now in this post-affirmative action moment, but also because each of those departments and programs bring different traditions of knowledge. And of course, that help to build a sense of belonging to those students. Sometimes we get trapped in this narrative of excellence as, let's say, blind in terms of race. But the reality is that if universities only have a European way of course offering and knowledge production, we are being explicit on excluding other populations and the knowledge that they might bring to universities.
So I'd like to hone in on this question, though, of whether it's a fluke, because I was thinking about it myself, and I was thinking of those courses which Harvard offers and which you've helped stimulate and create, is whether Harvard now has a more effective pipeline of Hispanic students where maybe younger brothers and sisters or colleagues from the same community are beginning to look at Harvard as a viable option despite the lack of affirmative action.
Yes, I think the creation of those programs or the existence of those class, I like to use the term academic infrastructure. It's basically building academic infrastructure so students can see and feel and know that these institutions are hopefully not only going to receive them, but then force them to deny who they are, but instead receive them and let them flourish. But that requires for institutions, and many educators have pointed out on this, that requires also for institutions to be honest of what do they mean when they say that they want diversity. Number one, do they want, or A, do they want a diverse body of students so they just can show numbers, but then they don't provide the resources for them to grow? Or the option B, do they are they open to be transformed by the presence of those students, faculty, and staff? And I think the second pathway would be the most interesting one. On one hand, because of course that helps universities to remain a vibrant space, but also because it keeps universities to stay at, let's say, the forefront of conversations in society. Because society is changing, and in particularly the United States is changing, the population trends, and that means also the conversations that are happening in society. I don't know how you see it, but I feel like because of these social pushbacks, on one hand, affirmative action, or just because we are during an election year, there's this sense that many of the conversations that happened during the George Floyd moment are now a bit up in the air. So maybe some people are unsure if we should keep up with those conversations on how are they being channeled during these times.
Could you be a little bit more specific about what you're thinking of in terms of Latinx?
That I think during this context, in a also post-affirmative action, but also in a post George Floyd era, where there is, I would say, an attack on terms like critical race theory or diversity and belong, then maybe there is a fear on trying to make Latinidad a polarizing term. And by doing that, there's the risk of not talking about these different layers that Latinidad has. So as we are celebrating Latino Heritage Month and understanding the context in where we are, also remembering that these conversations are still happening and that we should not forget to incorporate or to recognize the issues with the term Latinidad and also the communities that are usually left out from that conversation, which, as we spoke before, are mostly indigenous, Afro-descendant, and also from gender minorities.
Thank you very much. Society really is changing, evolving here. Latinos are the second largest voting bloc. In this election, there are 36.2 million people eligible to vote. But this demographic, as you pointed out, is a mosaic made up of different nations of origin, languages, values, and political ideology. So that makes it really hard to appeal to this voting group. It's a challenge. What do you see as the role of the Latinx community in the upcoming election? And who is the Latinx community that's able to vote?
Yes, in 2024, of course, the conversation about Latinidad is attached to the so-called Latino vote that, as you mentioned, is very diverse. And I think that should be the first acknowledgement. Some campaigns are trying to let's say, put the Latino vote in different blocks or even different regions across the country. Let's say the votes of Cubans in South Florida is certainly different from Mexican Americans in the Chicago area. But also it leads into understanding the mechanisms and how those communities get together, how they communicate, and how they engage with politics in the United States. To put a couple of examples, during the pandemic, there was a huge conversation about the problems of misinformation that led to people refusing to get vaccines or that they didn't know exactly how the virus was transmitted. And it took a while for US officials and just for, let's say, many people working on that issue to recognize that apps like WhatsApp were important channels for that were used by immigrant communities, and they were putting a lot of emphasis on other places such as, let's say, Facebook and other platforms, but they didn't let's say recognize or didn't reach out to see how communities get together, or they didn't necessarily put much attention on how, let's say, everyday social interactions were so important in many of the Latino neighborhoods. Moving that into fast forward to 2024, understanding also those logistics on how people engage with information, and also that many Latinos are always looking at US politics through the lenses of their home country's politics. So also understanding that aspect and having a message that recognizes that situation would be very important for this current election.
How important is language?
Language is also very important as well. Sometimes when we think of the present or even the future of Latinidad, we, by putting too much emphasis that yes, sometimes people forget that Latinos are US citizens and there have been here for many generations, but still Spanish is a very important language, and Portuguese, and nowadays also indigenous languages like Quechua or Cachiquel. So being also intentional on the role of language in a society that still punishes people for speaking other languages, or that might see or might portray speakers of language different than English as second-class people, it is an important, crucial aspect to consider and to work on.
You've worked a lot in popularizing Latinx culture, particularly with the collaborative work you did with Dora the Explorer and the Lost City of Gold. Do you have any new cultural projects?
I've been working more lately on education and in local communities. And I think that's an aspect that, as you mentioned, I have been an advisor to film, also to pieces of theater. So those have been things that I've been doing in the past few years. But another aspect that I've been getting involved that maybe is not as, let's say, pop culture, but I think still very important, is working with local teachers, and also working with immigration lawyers who, as we were talking a few minutes ago, they are starting to learn the diversity of languages within the Latino population. Something that is, I would say, a new phenomenon. I was just listening to an interview with the Secretary of Homeland Security, and he was acknowledging in that interview that they usually don't see Ecuador as a country that brings migrants to the United States. But now that's the situation. They need to see that they not only speak Spanish, but they also speak Quechua. And unfortunately, due to the situation happening in the Andes, now migrants from Peru are also coming in big numbers and asking for asylum at the US border. And therefore, that requires talking to lawyers and explaining that context, and also the landscape in regards to language as well.
Mhm. When you say you work with local teachers, is that on the high school level? What level is that? What communities?
Yeah, so one aspect that it has been brought to my attention is that after or because of the pandemic, many students of Latino descent or who identify as Latinos, Hispanics, there has been a drop in attendance to college. Now, many teachers are trying to find ways to make college more appealing for students too, so they can apply and go. And for that, we need, again, to create the conditions. Unfortunately, the affirmative action ruling doesn't send a very good message. Actually, it might even deter people from thinking of if colleges are a place for them. And therefore, teachers are trying to find different strategies. And that means by, for example, creating honor societies or reaching out to professionals so they can look at to models or ideas on how, let's say, keeping their language could be good. And by language, I'm meaning Spanish or Cachiquel or Quichua into their professional development, and to consider college, to don't deny that possibility.
That's really interesting and valuable work, Americo. Do you have any sort of dream project that you just haven't gotten around to yet?
Ooh, well, I would like to expand the efforts of an organization that we got to start called the Quechua Alliance. That's something we started almost 10 years ago, which organizes cultural events around Quechua and Andean culture in the United States. We were able to host one of the annual gatherings at Harvard in 2023. And we hosted this year's event at Northwestern University in Chicago. And we do these gatherings, we do educational workshops, and it's an intergenerational space. We work all the way from, let's say, with young people, but also with elders, because we want to be intentional on educational dynamics that sometimes, even though I work at, let's say, in higher education, something that sometimes I wish we could be more intentional is on intergenerational learning spaces. So that's something that I would hope to put more effort or in the future with the team that is part of the Quechua Alliance.
That's something that really comes out of Hispanic culture too, in the sense that in the US culture, kids generally move out when they're 18. The grandparents are people who live far away. There's not that much sense of intergenerational, except maybe at Thanksgiving and Christmas.
Yes,
Um,
and what you're saying that it might sound, let's say, more anecdotal, like in the sense of, as you said, families, Latinos living with abuelita in the house and not seeing that as something wrong, but it's just part of the family dynamics. We saw that during the pandemic, that actually helped many people to keep up with their well-being. And let's say during my classes of Latinx studies, we've been able to talk about that. And then we found out that there has been people actually doing research about those dynamics. And that's what, and therefore recognizing a value, like what we might just see as a practice, then it be seen as a strategy of coping or community strength. This is what I mean when, let's say, when universities need to have those spaces. So research and recognition of what these different communities bring, and not to only see them as objects of studies, but the same way as we see other traditions of knowledge, that has to be recognized and studied. And in that sense, the existence of Hispanic Heritage Month or Latino Heritage Month or Latinx Heritage Month can be a window to learn more about the different layers that beyond what we might just, let's say, know from school. But last semester that I was teaching this class on urban Latinidad, we were learning about the Young Lords, this organization in Chicago that did huge community organization and political activism and work during the times of civil rights. And they built community clinics and they tried to get into local politics. And for many of the students, that was the first time they were learning from that. So how can we make this more mainstream? That's also that happening by putting these issues into the curricula and into the public conversation.
That's really great. You've been so active in promoting Hispanic culture here at Harvard and the community. You've been very active in promoting Hispanic culture here at Harvard and at the community at large. So let's get a little personal here. What's your favorite Latinx piece of music? What's your favorite Latinx artist? And what is your favorite Latinx food?
Starting with music, I like Coco, which is a band from California. And also, speaking of California, I also like Becky G. So those are musicians that I really enjoy. In terms of artists, I could be like, if we're talking about media and shows, I really like Gina Rodriguez and the work that she does in different shows. But also, I appreciate the work, the visual work of, I don't know if he would consider himself Latino or Latinx, but who is an Aymara artist, but he has spent time in the US in connection with Latino communities. He recently created a mural in Philadelphia. And the food, I would go for Peruvian ceviche because I'm Peruvian. I love that food.
Thank you for being with us here at Faculty Voices. You've been listening to Americo Mendoza-Mori. He's an interdisciplinary scholar whose research focuses on U.S. Latinx and Indigenous communities. He's affiliated with Harvard's Committee on Ethnicity, Migration, Rights, and is currently teaching at Northeastern University. He's here to celebrate with us for Hispanic Heritage Month. Thank you, Americo.
Thank you.